mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bob Johnson at the David Group. Thank you for joining our webinar today, focusing in on employer branding in transitions. Our agenda today, we're going to cover three main topics. First, we're going to look at what we would dub the three choices of employer brand management in times of transition. We're then going to look at benchmarking and gap analysis. And finally, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about high-performing internal communication practices. As a reminder, our format for this webinar series is that we like to keep these to around 30 minutes. Hopefully we won't go too much over than that. And our intent here is just to give you a few ideas, to give you to get your mind thinking about issues related to employer branding and employee communications, and just to get you going if you have some interest in these types of programs or initiatives. Again, my name is Bob Johnson, and I am the practice leader here at the David Group. I'm the practice leader for our workforce communications practice. Before we get started, here's a little background about us. We are HR's ad agency. What we do is we apply advertising and marketing practices to help organizations attract and retain talent. The focus, however, of my practice group is really twofold. We work hard to help our clients strengthen their employer brands, and then we work hard to help them engage their people. And we know if we do those two things, we'll help them cut the cost of talent. But let's get into our webinar today. And again, our first part of this webinar is, let's take a look at employer branding in times of transition. And it's interesting, actually 2015 was a record year for mergers and acquisitions. You may not have noticed, but it was, in fact, it surpassed the previous record of mergers and acquisition transactions that was set in 2007. But even though it was a record year for mergers and acquisitions, we still know that 70 to 90% of those acquisitions may end up being what Roger Martin might categorize as being an abysmal failure. And this is taken from an article that Roger Martin had written and was just published in the Harvard Business Review just recently. And one of the things they did was they looked at kind of what makes an acquisition successful and what makes an acquisition unsuccessful. So when we think about the fact that 70 to 90% of acquisitions really don't work out in the long run, the real question is, what's the cause of that? And what Martin found was that the reason that most acquisitions don't work out is acquiring companies tend to focus more on obtaining value for just themselves. So I was thinking about this and thinking about a way to kind of describe this, at least from our perspective. So we have an ad agency, and if I was thinking about acquiring another agency, and if I was really just focused more on fulfilling an acquisition for my needs, I may look to acquiring another agency to gain access to a new market. Or I may look to gain access or get some new technology that we could take to our clients. Or maybe there's another agency where there's just a really great creative designer, and I want to acquire that agency just to have access to that talent. But what Martin found was that companies that really are successful in acquisitions tend to be really focused on giving value to the acquired company. So if you just take a pause and think about that, it's really kind of a different model than what we've seen in a lot of M&A activity. So what they're saying is, and what they found through this study that was published in the Harvard Business Review, is that successful acquisitions happen when the acquiring company focuses on giving value to the acquired company. So again, in my model, what I just talked about, if I were to acquire another agency, maybe I'd do so because I see opportunity in that agency and all they need is an infusion of capital. Or maybe they need better management practices that we could give to them. Or maybe there's some type of opportunity for skill transfers that makes both organizations stronger. Or maybe in the same vein, there's some resource sharing that could happen between the two organizations. Now these are the 4 items that Martin cites as ways to be successful in acquisitions. We would add one more, and particularly for this discussion, we would add that if you're able to infuse employer branding, that is another way of giving value to the transaction. And of course, when we think about employer branding, the things that we think about include such things as employer brand promise, attributes, employee value propositions, and certainly internal communications effectiveness. So, just kind of taking off on what Martin had written about, we believe that a purposeful employer brand, one that is really kind of deeply rooted in mission, culture, and values, is a great way to bestow value between two organizations that are coming together. So when we think, though, about multiple organizations coming together, and in our kind of discussion today, we're talking about a merger and acquisition. So that's typically two organizations coming together. We see that there are basically 3 choices that can be made when thinking about the employer brand. First is you could either use the acquirer's employer brand. Second, you can use the employer brand of the acquired. Or third, we can create a kind of merged or hybrid employer brand that's taking the best pieces of each organization. Given what we just saw from Roger Martin, sometimes even though it's more work and it takes more kind of planning and organization, the third option may be the best for many situations. So here's our kind of to-do for this thought process. What we really need to do is establish kind of the employer brand baseline. And that baseline should be something that will deliver the most value to the organization. We call that baseline the benchmark. And so let's talk a little bit about benchmarking and the process of gap analysis. So our goal here is to create a roadmap to managing your employer brand. And we know that if we can do that, if we have that kind of plan to help us manage an employer brand during transition, along the way, we're going to strengthen the overall employer brand as well. And here's a tool that we suggest that we're going to use, and that is a gap analysis. And what we mean by this is that if we can benchmark and then compare the employer brand elements and the communication practices of each of the two organizations that are coming together, and by comparing and contrasting them, that will help us, or that will give us a roadmap to where we can focus on areas of need, and it helps us to prioritize as well, how we're going to go about creating a unified employer brand for the new organization. So where do we start? Well, as we just mentioned in the prior section, we want to start by defining and documenting the employer brand promise, the attributes, and the employee value proposition elements of the new organization. Given that there's a certain amount of imperative that's assigned to or aligned to a merger or an acquisition. We think that at this moment in the in the history of that transaction, our efforts should be given on trying to find those things that it's going to unify both purpose and direction for the new workforce. And if we could do that, if we could define that and document that, that will become our baseline as we go forward. So let's just pause and kind of reassert this. What we're saying here is that before we start looking at the two individual organizations that are coming together, we want to kind of set forth the ideal benchmark of what it is we need to be successful moving forward. And once we do that, we then want to benchmark the current employer brand promise attributes and communication practices of each of the organizations. So again, we have kind of our top line benchmark. Now we're going to look at the two organizations separately. And some of the items or where we're going to start to look is we want to look at their respective employer brand platforms. We want to look at their respective employee engagement data. And that's kind of interesting because many organizations do some form of employee engagement survey or measurement. Now, not everyone is the same, so in order to kind of compare and contrast two organizations, there may be some mapping that's needed there. We're also going to want to look at whatever HR data that we could find, whether it's onboarding stats, performance stats, data or information that it's extracted from stay interviews, exit interviews, anything that we can get our hands on to kind of put into the mix. And again, we're going to want to be mapping between the two organizations, and we'll kind of show you an illustration of this in a few minutes. Finally, we'll either want to perform an internal communications audit, or if they've been recently done in the respective organizations, these are all kind of inputs of where we begin to get information or data to help us start benchmarking and contrasting the two organizations. So what are we going to look for, though, specifically? Among the items we want to look for are dimensions of culture, mission, and values. And these are really kind of your employer brand promise, your attributes. It also includes elements of your employee value proposition. Whatever it is that we would categorize as being, ties to your everyday experiences. And if you've been on our webinars before, you know that we are very strong proponents of an employer brand as being defined by your everyday experiences. So first off, we want to look at different dimensions of your employer brand. Secondly, we do want to look at the different dimensions and the drivers of engagement within each organization. And engagement is kind of an interesting thing because employee engagement is kind of defined and measured differently in every organization. So however you define it, we want to grab those things. That's what we're going to be looking for, because it's going to give us a window into what people are thinking and how they're motivated, respective in their own organizations. And when we put these things together, that's what we want to be looking at. And again, however you define it. For us, we define employee engagement as the combination of line of sight and commitment. And then we also want to be mindful of, for change management purposes, that we need to pay close attention to a couple of additional items in addition to the first two that we just talked about. First, we want to make sure that we're looking at transparency. Do we have a transparent work environment? We also want to be looking for change readiness. In other words, how ready is our workforce? For the oncoming change of obviously two organizations coming together? And then finally, we want to think about and look at empowerment. And we'll show you in a second what we mean by this. The studies actually talk about making sure that people have an individual voice. And for me, I interpret that as being a dimension of empowerment. If I have an individual voice, if my voice is heard, I'm empowered by my organization. So since we are dealing with a lot of change, and since we are dealing with folks who from two different organizations who are coming together, and as communicators, we're interested in how we can make this a positive story, not only for them internally, but a positive story for us to take externally. We have to deal with change. And so here's a few ideas related to dealing with change. We know that studies show, and a particular study that we're going to look at right now shows that 54% of employees actually feel positive about workplace change. They're confident, they're excited. I don't know if the study goes as deep as saying that they embrace change, but it's good to know that just slightly above half your workforce is actually kind of open to change. However, if slightly half is open, then slightly under half, may be not as open to change. 45% of your workforce would feel negative about workplace change. They're nervous, they're anxious, they're not sure what the future is going to hold. They potentially could be hostile. That's the word that the survey used. I'm not sure how that manifests itself, but generally speaking, here's a clear contrast between those who are feeling good about workplace change and those who don't. But if we want to improve that number, if we want to make people more ready for change, in other words, excited about the change that's coming, particularly through a transition, then we know that when workers feel that their company is open and transparent, that they are more than 3 times as likely to be excited about the change that's coming. We also know that when workers feel that their voice matters, they are 4 times as likely to be excited about that change that's coming. So these are 2 areas, again, as I just referenced a few moments ago, that when we begin to put our talent communication programs together, we want to make sure that we're addressing transparency and to a level of empowerment. And again, my view is that making sure that people's voices are heard is a form of empowerment. If we can do those 2 things, then our workforce is going to be far more ready to be accepting of the workplace change. And there's some good news about that, because we know that when workers are excited about change, 38% are more likely to recommend their company as a place to work. 25% are motivated to work even harder. 40% are more likely to believe that the company is the best place to work. And these are all kind of tenets and foundational aspects of employer branding. So as we begin to, we've now talked about benchmarking and kind of gathering the information. We've now dealt with kind of dealing with change, so to speak. And we're all working towards getting to a place where the workforce feels unified and connected. Let's do a quick illustration, though, of how we might apply the gap analysis to your workforce, and in particular in comparing and contrasting 2 different workforces. And let's use employee engagement data kind of as the basis. Again, we've talked about other inputs, but this is just an easy way to visualize what we're talking about here. So here's a gap analysis using employee engagement data. And again, this is we just kind of made this up. We're just kind of having some fun here at the shop, and this is just kind of supposed to be illustrative of a cut or a dimension of a few questions. Obviously, you would have a full-blown set of questions, but in this example, we're kind of looking at first ABC company, which in this illustration is the acquiring company. So in this scenario, we can see just on these few questions that we're talking about whether or not I, as an employee of ABC company, have a good understanding of how I help my company succeed, my commitment level to the company, whether my supervisor helps me, and whether or not I have the tools to meet my goals. Again, a personal bias, I think that's more related to empowerment, but so this is kind of the numbers from our organization. We're the acquiring organization. But then we go and we look at the acquired company, the XYZ company, and we map to the same type of questions, and here's their responses. And so as you can see, we have one set of data points, a second set of data points, and what we want to do then is to combine them. And by combining them, this allows us to get a sense of where our gaps may be. And again, we just kind of made this up, so they're not dramatic gaps here, or we just kind of threw numbers out there. But if we begin to think about tailoring a talent communication program to unify the two organizations, and we know that we're assuming that in this scenario that the ABC company is the model that we want to drive people to, or that's the framework we want to go to, we can see where we have some work to be done in relation to understanding or how a company supports their employees to succeed. Now, what's kind of interesting is, again, we kind of made this up on the fly, so I didn't even think about this until after we kind of laid it out. There is an interesting thought related to this. So there is one stat item on this sheet where it's flipped, where the XYZ company actually performs far better in relation to supervisors and their relationship to their workforce. So if I were in-house at this company or providing services to this situation, I might say to our team, hey, that's kind of interesting. Maybe there's something happening at the XYZ company. Maybe they have a great manager training program, or maybe they're really focused on working with their managers to get their people engaged. We need to look at that. Maybe we need to, while we're sharing our best practices on these other dimensions, we want to take their best practice and bring it to us. And this is very kind of interesting when you think about Roger Martin's original premise at the beginning, where successful acquisitions really kind of come about where there's a lot more sharing instead of taking. So let's move on, and we'll spend a few minutes talking about high-performing communication practices. And the first thought that may come to your mind as we kind of enter into this section of the webinar is, why are we talking about internal communications? I mean, we've kind of positioned this webinar as being about employer branding. Why is it important for us to now think about internal communications? And from our perspective, in this situation, if we're asked to come in, and we have been, this topic has come up recently with several of our either clients or prospective clients who are going through a period of transition. Our focus really is to think about employer brand in a slightly different way than we would if there wasn't the coming together of two different cultures. So for this moment, for this scenario, we really want to focus more on uniting different groups of people under one shared sense of purpose and one shared sense of direction. Thus, we think the best way to do that is through internal communications. And this actually works out nice for us because part of, I think, the way we think is a little bit different than our peers within the space. Is we are very interested in infusing employer brand with employee communications. We think that's kind of the next level of employer branding, so it's very natural for us to think about internal communications as a way to strengthen an employer brand, particularly in a time of transition. So we believe that if we could bring two different companies together under one sense of purpose and one sense of direction, if that's accomplished, the employer brand will actually be a lot stronger. We don't have measurement on that yet, but that is certainly a belief of ours. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by internal communications, and then we'll share also a few best practices. So for us, what we mean by internal communications is that high-performing internal communication programs are, by our definition, planned. They're not by accident. They're systematic. In other words, there's a design program where the communication programs are rolled out, managed, measured. They're very purposeful, and this is probably the most important point, they're aligned to specific business needs. And in this case, and what we're talking about in terms of managing your talent communications in a time of transition, we definitely think the business need is to unify everybody under a common purpose. But we know that if we do these things well, if we have a planned and systematic and purposeful approach to our internal communications, we're going to be able to successfully retain great people. We're going to help people, do great things, which is a hallmark of many employers of choice. We're going to empower people to not only have great workplace environment and workplace experiences, we're going to help them tell that great story. And they're going to want to tell that great story. So how do we start? Where do we start building out our internal communications program to help us succeed in this time of transition? Well, I'm going to share with you now the hierarchy of internal communications success. And this is kind of a long-standing internal communication theory that has been developed by others. We adopt it and we use it with our clients, but it is really kind of the hallmark of what you want to do. And you want to start with the basics. We want to make sure that as we put our plans together, particularly as we focus on managing an employer brand during a time of transition, we want to make sure that we have skilled communications and skilled communicators in place. We want to make sure that we have well-designed, well-planned messaging and an organized approach in terms of timing and release. We want to make sure that we are communicating in the right channels. We also want to make sure that we're listening and we're gathering intelligence related to the messages that we're putting out. And this is really crucial. We want to make sure that our line managers, those who are kind of the face of the organization to our workforce, we want to make sure that they are very clear about their role in this process. And I'll share with you why in a second, because this is how we're going to make it work. We're going to link our communications to our business strategy. Again, our business strategy in this scenario is kind of unifying folks under a common mission and direction, but we want to make sure that our communications are tied to those efforts. And again, we're going to fall back on the homework that we've already done through our benchmarking. We want to make sure that we evaluate any measurement data that comes back. We want to make sure that we're improving as we go forward. We also want to make sure that we're providing feedback to senior management. And when we say known feedback, basically, it's measured, it's credible, it's not just anecdotal. And we want to make sure that our line managers, once they're clear about their role, we want to make sure that they are trained in our messaging and what they have to do. And we also want to make sure that they know that they're being evaluated. Because if we do all these things, then this is what our internal communication success is going to look like. We're going to be, our messaging, our employer brand and internal communications messaging is going to be integral to the success of the change. And again, in this instance, we're talking about change related to a transaction. Our leaders and line managers are going to create line of sight, and we believe line of sight is critical to employee engagement, so they're going to work together to create this line of sight for our workforce. And essentially what we're going to say is what's going to happen is success will look terrific, because what it means is that we are all kind of walking the talk. And if all this happens, what we have is we really have a scenario in which senior leaders are not passive about our internal communications, and they're not passive about our employer branding communications. They're involved in help shaping this. So we go from the basic foundations at the bottom all the way to the top. So let's talk a little bit about some best practices for internal communications. And there's a bunch, but this is just kind of a quick snapshot of what we think we should do and what we definitely shouldn't do. And right off the bat, we should be planning content. And we definitely don't want to just make it up as we go along, but we want to have strong, high-performing internal communication programs, plan content. At the same time, though, we don't want content to be the only thing we think about in terms of our communication programs. We really want our communication programs to be centered around fulfilling a business need. And we want to have specific outcomes defined. As a contrast, what we don't want is we don't just want an assumption that results will speak for themselves. We want to have addressing a specific business needs, and we want to be able to define our outcomes. We also want to make sure that we make it relevant to the audiences that we're reaching out to. And the way we do that is, again, we rely on the homework that we've done in our benchmarking process so that we can connect to the employees' everyday experiences. What we don't want to do is we don't want to just go through this process because we just have this kind of internal need to communicate. And that happens a lot. We see many organizations, and they're good-hearted, good-willed people who just had the right gut feeling, which is, hey, we need to communicate. But what they're not doing right is they're not connecting to a real business need, and they're not connecting to what's relevant to the audience. So we don't just want to do a communication program because our business managers think it's the right thing to do all by itself. Finally, we want to make sure that we are choosing the channels that are most appropriate and most effective for each audience. And in doing so and in executing, we want to make sure that we measure our results. We do not, by contrast, want to pick channels just because, well, that's the way we've done it and we're not open to doing it any other way, or because it's most convenient. The message here throughout these sets of practices is we need to be focused on our audience's preferences and needs and not ours. Another thought related to best practices includes thinking about creating a purpose map. This will help us shape our communications as we move forward. And what we mean by a purpose map is that it's just a way to think about, what's the purpose of each communication vehicle or item, what's our style, what's our channel, how's it going to be delivered. Purpose is really related to, are we endeavoring to inform? Are we endeavoring to influence? Do we want to increase commitment? All those kind of things. These are just a few kind of samples, but when we put the plan together, we'd want everybody to kind of rally around this thinking. It also helps to build some consistency in our messaging. So I see we're just about out of time if we're not a minute or two over. So let me just kind of sum up here very quickly. And again, it was a lot to kind of throw at you guys. We probably could spend hours talking about this, but in terms of summing up, when we think about managing an employer brand during a transition, we're going to want to align employer brand and employee communications, and we're going to want to focus on unifying the new combined workforce, and we want to unify them to a common mission and purpose. We kind of glossed over it before, but we're going to set an initial benchmark of what that common mission and purpose is, and clearly as the time passes and as things kind of settle, we may go back and refine it a little bit, but our immediate management of the employer brand should really be focused on kind of unifying the workforce. We also want to make sure that we're speaking to the engagement drivers that resonate, because that's what's really going to get people engaged and bought into the new kind of entity quicker and more strongly than if you don't speak to engagement drivers. We also want to make sure that we're going to execute tactics that's going to connect with our audiences. And this could be everything from branded templates to responsive templates to what's in it for me type messaging. Responsive templates, for those who may not be familiar with that term, is, are we using the latest technology that helps us deliver our messages in whatever platform they're received? So I may send an email, maybe it's an HTML email, and a responsive design template will allow that to be delivered on a mobile application, tablet, iPhone, whatever it may be. So we want to make sure that our messages are being delivered. And then finally, we definitely want to be mindful about the practices of change management. We want to make sure that in a time of transition, when just about half your workforce are excited about the new opportunity and the other half are anxious and nervous about the opportunity, we want to make sure that we are communicating in a very transparent and open way. And we want to make sure that we give everybody a chance so that they feel that their voice is being heard. If we could do those things while we do all those other things that we talked about, we are on track to having a far better, successful process, and hopefully a better acquisition or combination of two organizations coming together. So we're just a little bit over time. Let me do one quick thing. I'll check to see if there are any questions, and I don't see any questions in the queue. Thank you for spending your time with us. Again, we kind of structure these webinars to roll through 30 minutes. We put a lot of stuff out there. Hopefully you felt that you received value for your time spent with us. You will receive a copy of this presentation directly from me. It's a personal email. It's not an automated email. If there's anything else, any other questions you would have offline, just shoot them our way. Not a problem. We're not sure what our next webinar will be, but if you have an idea or if there's something you'd like us to talk about, please let us know. We'll probably take the next month off to enjoy summer, but we'll be back soon to have yet another one of our webinars. Again, thank you for your time and have a great day. Thank you.